Politburo, when decisions are made, but none of this decision is openly communicated, and it's surrounded by a lot of secrecy. And both Abiy Ahmed and Debretsion Gebremichael are probably the two most tech-savvy political leaders in Ethiopia. And Debretsion was also a trained engineer, even if he left to join the struggle in the 1970s. And he was the one who was running the guerrilla, the clandestine radio for the TPLF. And for a long time, he was seen very much as the mastermind of technological development in Ethiopia. And he ended up being the chairman of the TPLF later on. And Abiy Ahmed also trained engineers, and with specialization in surveillance. And it seems that the two of them, again, I would have loved to be kind of a fly on the wall, and I'm sure there were very tense conversation between the two, both at the level of political ideology, but also at the level of technology. And technology, I'm sure, was very much part of their imagining and envisioning Ethiopia. And I think we will be able to see only the results of that. It will probably be impossible unless one of them decide to just reveal what was being discussed to see how this conversation happened. But maybe the results of these can be analyzed and provide some insight in how ideology and technology connected and led to specific developments. Maybe there is a space for another book there.
Yeah, you should absolutely go for it. I mean, just to take a slightly devil's advocate position for a second, if you think of the Frankenstein nations created by British and French colonialists, which are not functioning 60 years after independence, 140 years, 130 years after they were invented by these crazy red lines on a map. And yet, a coherent state really is a necessary actor for development, has been proved again and again. And, that's another podcast. Could China-style political consolidation via this control mechanism offered by technology used in China today, could that offer some kind of useful coherency? Of course, authoritarian, yes, but able to deliver on development?
This is a complex question and a very interesting space to explore, also a very dangerous one. And I will go back to a very...
That's my favorite place.
Very controversial figure and a politician, an ideologue, and a very committed and problematic political leader who was Meles Zenawi. And Meles Zenawi, in many public forums, I remember a very impassioned response he gave at the World Economic Forum sometimes in the 2010s, before 2 or 3 years before he died. And where he was stressing the issue of timing and saying he was answering a question exactly about telecommunication, but also about banking. And he was saying the economic crisis, 2007 and 2008, has shown the fragility of the global financial system. And he was saying this is one of the reasons Ethiopia has decided not to liberalize banking, allowing foreign banks to come in. It has allowed some form of competition between local banks. And he was saying the enormous level of complexity of the international banking system could not be managed by Ethiopian financiers, politicians, technocrats, and bureaucrats. And that's why we have decided. So we have to strengthen ourselves before we could compete. And I think history and the GDP has proven him right on that front. So there are some areas where actually a tighter control by the state could prove beneficial if the economy has to develop in ways that are tuned into the capacity of a state at a particular point in time. And this could also apply, in theory, to the development of the information societies. The caveat there is that, and this is something I usually don't generalize, but I think I can generalize on this one. People like to speak freely, and I think they like to speak freely in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, in Italy, in South Africa, and a state that sort of decide what can and cannot be said will always be seen as patronizing and abhorrent to some degrees. So when it comes to like tailored technocratic moves towards allowing the private sector and the public sector to collaborate in certain types of innovations, I think there can be some argument to be made there. But when it comes to the state deciding what can and cannot be said in 2019 as compared to 2022, I think that will never go down. And we'll see it also in China and Hong Kong. At some point, they say, you know what, we had enough. And we are articulate enough, we are like educated enough to articulate at different ways of thinking. So certain measures that may apply when it comes to developing special economic zones or like having the states intervening in banking, regulating, probably. But when it comes to speech, I think that's a tough argument to make.
You have, you bring in this interesting concept of authoritarian deliberation, a way of that China channels dissent in a I don't know if it's a productive manner, but it's in a way which allows people to have a voice without it bubbling over. Is that something that you could see being developed in different African countries?
Well, actually, this is something that in my many interaction with Ethiopian leaders over time, and I had the chance to develop a number of research projects, and some of these projects were in conversation with the government itself, because it's definitely an important actor, even if we might not agree with all the measures that they implement. And I sort of kind of suggested or like brought and printed some of the copies of the articles by Hebo and Warren articulating this idea of authoritarian deliberation, saying, well, maybe this is a good intermediate step, as we just discussed, in allowing voice and allowing a conversation coming from the grassroots, influencing policies at the top. And I still think that model is an interesting one that, again, it doesn't fit the idealized version of the public spheres, but I think it could be a practical way to allow voices coming from ordinary citizen or group of coalition of citizen and other institution to reach a kind of momentum to sort of force public authority to respond. And I strongly advise people to read the article by Hebo and Mark Warren. At the same time, that article was written, I believe, could be wrong, like 2012 or like 2010s. And it was interesting.
Things have moved on,
and that's exactly the point. It's interesting to see how it was possible at the time, and there was a number of examples, and it will take a long time to go through them. I just have to generalize, but of uproar from the bottom that forced a kind of change that even democracies wouldn't have embraced. And one of the reasons is democratically elected leaders can say, you know what, next year there are elections, you can vote us out. You can't say that in China. And so public authorities, in order to maintain some level of consensus, did have to respond to some of these claims. But the Xi Jinping version of idolizing the leader and curbing dissent, it has moved away from that idea of authoritarian deliberation towards a kind of cult of the leader. Powers comes from the top, and certain things are simply like the red lines. So also the red lines have been moved further and further down. So this is another problem of embracing the idea of an authoritarian state. It's good for the economy, and maybe it's good for like some African states. if the power resides too much into the hands of those at the top, it becomes relatively easy to push these lines, and the authoritarian deliberation is left to the crumbs, or to very minimal policy spaces where big change can be brought. So it's also it's a continuum. I think authoritarian deliberation could be used and progressively move upwards. What we have seen in the case of China is actually being moved downwards. And this is problematic. And this is the problem of embracing too tightly a model, and that can historically change. And so we have also to adapt it. And also the support that we give to it may, as academics, as thinkers, and might be rolled back and say, you know what? Now it's not working.
Can we talk a little bit about the role of the state? You give this nice example of how the distribution of power plants in the UK and Germany is different, not for any technical reason, but purely because private shareholders, private interests are much stronger in the UK compared to Germany, where the states had a much greater role in organising the electrical power sector. Ethiopia, obviously, we've mentioned it, has a much stronger state relative to African peers. How did that affect the deployment of Chinese technology compared to other African countries with a less strong state?
Well, this is a fascinating space, and actually, my previous book was exactly about this question. So it was a whole book. I will try to summarize. It's interesting. One of the things that we often forget, I say as scholars, but also people discussing technology, people interested in technology, is ideology. We just think that technology does its own bit, and you can regulate a bit, but technology has its own wills and will prevail and will sort of arrange itself in certain ways. And this can be true in some places, but is definitely not true in a lot of them. So not just with regard to Chinese technology, but what the previous book is called The Politics of Technology in Africa was about. It was how the ideology that developed over 2 decades in Ethiopia during the guerrilla fight, and that was led by the TPLF against the dictatorship, the military dictatorship that ran Ethiopia between 1974 and 1991. That very ideology, imagining a vanguard of thinkers that had to connect with the masses, had profoundly influenced the deployment of technology in the first 20 years since the EPRDF came to power. And I gave this example about this technology that was deployed in schools, that deployed in public administration. And it was fascinating to see it was not Chinese technology. It was technology that was purchased. It was contracts that were made with companies in South Africa, in the US, and in other countries in Europe. How this technology was designed in very complicated ways, sometimes too complicated, to recreate that kind of idea of the political leaders speaking with the masses. So it was this complex system using satellite technology to connect the prime minister at the time, Meles Zenawi, with people gathered in school to indoctrinate them into what was the politics and the policies of the time. Something really unique that actually later on was somehow copied in other countries. Rwanda was one of them. And so this tells the story of how even countries that have limited technical capabilities could sort of intersect with this global availability of technology to produce something that is very much local and national. When China came, the story it's complicated and layered, and it was somehow different. So again, as I said earlier, and China, because of the $3 billion loan and because of having Huawei and ZTE developing this project, allowed Ethiopia to succeed, at least partially, into this complex project of maintaining monopoly Ethiopia is the only country left in Africa that has monopoly of telecommunication and